In 1757, Robert Clive led a force of approximately 3,000 British and Indian soldiers against the army of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal, at a place called Plassey. The Nawab's army numbered somewhere between 35 and 50,000 men. By any conventional military logic, the battle should not have been close. It was not close, but not in the direction that the number suggested. The British force won decisively. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled the field and was subsequently captured and killed. Bengal, the richest province of the Mughal Empire, with a GDP that historians estimate was roughly comparable to that of all of Britain at the time, passed under the effective control of the East India Company. The Battle of Plassey is usually taught as a story about military genius, about Clive's tactical brilliance, about the superiority of disciplined European infantry over the larger but less organized Indian force. It was none of those things. It was a story about money. Specifically, it was a story about debt. Mir Jafar, the commander of the largest section of the Nawab's army, had made a private arrangement with Clive before the battle. He would keep his forces out of the fighting in exchange for being installed as the next Nawab of Bengal. The arrangement was brokered by the Jagat Seth banking family, the most powerful banking house in Bengal, which had extensive lending relationships with both the East India Company and the Nawab's court, and which had concluded that its financial interests would be better served under company rule than under Siraj-ud-Dowlah, who had been making hostile gestures toward the banking community. Plassey was won not by firepower, but by financial engineering. The company had bought the battle before it was fought. This pattern, using financial relationships, debt, and the manipulation of credit to achieve political and military outcomes that force alone could not achieve, is the pattern that underlies the entire history of British imperial expansion. And it is almost entirely absent from the standard histories of the British Empire, which focus on naval power, military technology, administrative genius, and the civilizing mission, while treating the financial dimension as a backdrop rather than as the primary mechanism. What the standard histories get wrong about the British Empire is not the facts of what happened. The facts are extensively documented. What they get wrong is the causation. They present British imperial expansion as primarily a military and political phenomenon that happened to have financial consequences. The truth is almost exactly the reverse. British imperial expansion was primarily a financial phenomenon. The extension of British credit and British financial institutions into new territories that was backed by military force when necessary, and that generated the political structures of empire as a means of protecting the financial relationships that were its real substance. To understand this argument properly, you have to begin not in India, but in London, and not in the 18th century, but in 1694, with the founding of the Bank of England. The Bank of England was established in 1694 to solve a specific problem. England was at war with France, the 9 Years' War, one of the interminable conflicts of Louis XIV's reign, and the English government needed money. The traditional means of royal finance, taxation, borrowing from goldsmiths, forced loans from wealthy subjects, were insufficient to fund a modern war. The Dutch, who had recently imported their stadtholder William of Orange to become King of England in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, had a solution. The Dutch Republic had developed over the preceding century a sophisticated system of public finance in which the state borrowed money from investors at relatively low interest rates by pledging specific tax revenues as security, and by establishing institutional arrangements that gave investors confidence that the debt would be repaid. The Dutch had used this system to fund wars and commercial expansion at a scale that their small population would not otherwise have permitted. England would do the same. The Bank of England was established by a group of merchants who lent the government £1.2 million in exchange for a royal charter, allowing them to operate as a bank. The government used the loan to fund its war expenditure. The bank used its charter to issue banknotes, paper money, backed by the loans it had made to the government. The system worked because the bank's banknotes were trusted by the public and by merchants. They were, in effect, government debt in circulating form, backed by the credibility of the state and the specific tax revenues pledged to service the debt. England had acquired, in a single institutional innovation, the capacity to borrow for war at a scale and at interest rates that its previous financial arrangements had made impossible. The military consequences were immediate and significant. England, and after 1707, Britain, could now fund wars that would otherwise have been beyond its fiscal capacity. The War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, the American War of Independence, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, all of these were financed substantially through government borrowing at interest rates that the Bank of England system made possible. Britain's ability to fight wars was not primarily a function of its population size, France was much larger, or of its natural resources, or of the inherent courage of its soldiers. It was primarily a function of its ability to convert the future income of the British state into present military spending by borrowing against it. This capacity for debt-financed military spending gave Britain a structural advantage in the 18th and 19th century wars of empire that its rivals could not easily match. France had a larger population, a larger army, and in many respects a more developed economy. But France's public finance was, until the Revolution, a disaster, as we have explored in our video on the French Revolution, structured around a tax system that exempted the wealthy and could not fund wars without borrowing at rates that were eventually unsustainable. Spain had an empire producing silver from the Americas, but had repeatedly defaulted on its debts, destroying its credit and its ability to borrow cheaply when wars required it. The Netherlands had the financial sophistication but not the population or the military manpower to sustain a global empire. Britain was the country that combined, in the right proportions, the financial sophistication to borrow cheaply, the naval power to project force globally, and the commercial energy to identify and exploit the opportunities that force created. The combination was not inevitable. It was the product of specific institutional innovations and specific political choices. But once established, it was formidable. The East India Company was the primary vehicle through which British financial power was extended into Asia, and its story illustrates perfectly the relationship between debt, commercial expansion, and empire that the British system perfected. The company was established in 1600 with a royal charter, granting it a monopoly on English trade with Asia. For its first century and a half, it operated primarily as a trading company, buying Indian textiles, Chinese tea, Indonesian spices, and selling them in Europe at enormous profit. Its relationship with India was commercial, not colonial. It maintained trading posts, factories, in Indian ports, negotiated with local rulers for trading privileges, and used a combination of commercial advantage and occasional military force to protect its commercial position. What changed this relationship was debt, specifically the debt relationships that the company developed with Indian rulers, Indian merchants, and the Indian banking system. The company needed local credit to finance its operations between the arrival of goods from England and the sale of those goods in Indian markets, and between the purchase of Indian goods and their sale in Europe. Indian banking families, the Jagat Seth in Bengal, the Chettiars in South India, the Shroffs in Western India, provided this credit, and in providing it became enmeshed in the company's commercial and eventually political operations in ways that had profound consequences for what followed. The Indian rulers to whom the company sold military services, providing European-trained soldiers and artillery to Indian princes, engaged in the constant warfare of the 18th century, when the Mughal Empire was disintegrating and regional powers were competing for its inheritance, also became enmeshed in debt relationships with the company. The company charged for its military services. Indian rulers, who could not pay in cash, were encouraged to pay in territory, in trading privileges, in control of customs revenues. The debt that Indian rulers accumulated to pay for company military assistance became the mechanism through which commercial relationships were converted into territorial control. The Bengal operation after Plassey illustrates this mechanism precisely. After the battle, the company installed Mir Jafar as Nawab and extracted from him an enormous indemnity, payment for the costs of the military operation that had put him on the throne. Mir Jafar did not have the cash to pay the indemnity. He borrowed it from the Jagat Seth banking family. The Jagat Seth borrowed from the company. The company had created a circular debt structure in which the new Nawab was permanently indebted to the banking family, which was permanently indebted to the company, giving the company effective leverage over both. When Mir Jafar proved insufficiently compliant, he was replaced by another candidate, Mir Qasim, who was also indebted to the company from the moment of his installation. The revenues of Bengal, the land tax, the customs duties, the salt tax, became the security against which the company borrowed to finance its expanding military operations in other parts of India. The company used Bengal's revenues to conquer Madras, to fight the Maratha Confederacy, to defeat Tipu Sultan in Mysore. Each conquest generated new revenues that became security for new borrowing that financed the next conquest. The empire expanded not through the application of British taxpayer money, but through a self-financing cycle in which the revenues of conquered territories paid for the conquest of adjacent ones. The debt was the engine, the military force was the mechanism, and the territories that were conquered were simultaneously the prize and the security for the next round of borrowing. This model of debt-financed imperial expansion was not unique to India. It was the template that British imperial expansion followed across the world. In Egypt, the situation was, in some respects, even more transparent than in India, because the debt mechanism was deployed explicitly and without the commercial pretext that had characterized the company's operations. Egypt, in the 1860s and 1870s, was governed by the Khedive Ismail, an ambitious modernizer who wanted to transform Egypt into a European-style state. He borrowed heavily from European banks, primarily British and French, to build railways, canals, telegraphs, schools, and most expensively, to pay for Egypt's contribution to the construction of the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869 and which transformed Egypt's strategic position by making it the transit point for trade between Europe and Asia. The Suez Canal was one of the most important infrastructure projects of the 19th century. It was also the instrument through which Egypt became financially captured by its European creditors. The Khedive's borrowing was not simply imprudent. It was partly the product of systematic overcharging by the European banks that arranged his loans, charging enormous commissions, issuing bonds at deep discounts, and structuring the debt in ways that maximize the income of the intermediaries while maximizing the cost to Egypt. By the late 1870s, Egypt's debt service was consuming approximately 60% of the government's revenues. The country was effectively bankrupt. The Khedive was forced to sell Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company, purchased by the British government under Disraeli in 1875, in one of the most celebrated financial coups in British political history, and to accept an international debt commission that effectively transferred control of Egyptian finances to representatives of the European creditor nations. The Debt Commission, the Caisse de la Dette Publique, was staffed by British and French representatives who had the power to direct Egyptian revenue streams to debt service, regardless of the Egyptian government's other needs. It was, in effect, a foreign financial administration operating inside a nominally independent country, using the levers of debt to control Egyptian economic policy in the interests of foreign creditors. When Egyptians, led by the nationalist military officer Ahmad Urabi, rose against this arrangement in 1881 and 1882, Britain intervened militarily, bombarding Alexandria, landing troops, defeating Urabi's forces at Tel el-Kebir, and establishing a British occupation that would last until 1956. The British occupation of Egypt was presented to Parliament and to the British public as a temporary measure, a stabilization operation that would restore order, protect the Suez Canal, and allow a gradual return to Egyptian self-governance. It lasted 74 years, and it was undertaken, at its root, not to protect British strategic interests in the Suez route to India, though that was certainly a factor, but to protect the interests of British bondholders who held Egyptian government debt and whose income stream was threatened by the Urabi nationalist movement. The military intervention was the debt collection mechanism of last resort. The pattern repeated itself across the empire. In West Africa, British commercial houses extended credit to local trading networks, creating debt relationships that gave British merchants leverage over the terms of trade, and eventually over the political arrangements that governed the regions where trade occurred. When political instability threatened these commercial relationships, the British government intervened militarily to restore the conditions under which the debt relationships could be maintained. The military intervention was justified to Parliament and public as the protection of British subjects and British trade. Its underlying logic was the protection of the credit relationships that were the real infrastructure of British commercial dominance. In South America, which was never formally colonized by Britain, but which was, for much of the 19th century, as thoroughly penetrated by British financial and commercial power as any formal colony, the debt mechanism operated without even the fig leaf of imperial administration. British banks lent to Latin American governments. The governments used the borrowed money to build railways and ports and urban infrastructure that was designed, above all, to move commodities from the interior to the coast for export to Britain and to facilitate the import of British manufactured goods. The railways were not built to connect Latin American cities to each other. They were built on gauges chosen for British rolling stock, connecting commodity-producing regions to British-owned or British-controlled ports. serving British commercial interests above all others. When Latin American governments defaulted on their debts, as they did repeatedly throughout the 19th century, because the debt terms were often structured to make default almost inevitable, British creditors appealed to the British government for support. Sometimes, that support took the form of diplomatic pressure. Sometimes, it took the form of the threat of naval intervention. The implicit message was consistent. Latin American governments that defaulted on British debt would face consequences. The explicit message was that the right arrangement was a rescheduling of the debt on terms acceptable to creditors, with specific revenue streams pledged as security, which meant that British creditors had, through the rescheduling process, acquired claims on specific Latin American tax revenues that gave them a degree of control over Latin American economic policy, not very different in substance from what the Caisse de la Dette Publique exercised in Egypt. The City of London was the financial center through which all of this operated, and understanding the city's role is essential to understanding the British Empire's financial mechanism. The City of London in the 19th century was the most sophisticated financial center in the world. It was the center of global insurance through Lloyd's of London. It was the center of global trade finance through the Bill of Exchange market and the accepting houses that guaranteed commercial paper. It was the center of global capital markets through the bond market in which governments and corporations around the world borrowed money from British investors. And it was the center of the gold standard system through the Bank of England's role as the manager of global monetary arrangements. The gold standard, the system under which currencies were convertible into gold at fixed rates, which Britain adopted formally in 1821, and which most of the major economies of the world adopted in the latter decades of the 19th century, was, in many respects, the financial infrastructure of the British Empire. By tying the world's currencies to gold and setting the price of gold in sterling, the gold standard effectively made sterling the world's reserve currency. Countries that ran trade deficits with Britain, which was most countries, since Britain was the world's leading manufacturer and exporter through much of the 19th century, accumulated sterling debts. Countries that ran surpluses with Britain accumulated sterling assets, deposits in London banks, holdings of British government bonds. Either way, their financial relationships ran through London and were subject to the interest rates and credit conditions set by the Bank of England. The Bank of England's interest rate decisions were the most powerful single lever in the global economy for most of the 19th century. When the bank raised rates, capital flowed to London from the rest of the world, creating financial pressure on governments and businesses everywhere that had borrowed in sterling, or that depended on London credit markets for their operating finance. When the bank lowered rates, capital flowed out to the periphery of the global economy, funding new investments in railways and mines, and plantations in the colonies and semi-colonies. The rhythm of boom and bust in the 19th century global economy was substantially the rhythm of Bank of England interest rate policy, which was conducted in the interests of maintaining the convertibility of sterling into gold and protecting the financial interests of the city, rather than in the interests of the global economy as a whole. The consequences for the countries on the periphery of this system were severe. Argentina, which became deeply integrated into the British financial system in the second half of the 19th century, experienced the bearing crisis of 1890, a financial crisis triggered by the overextension of British lending to Argentina and the subsequent crisis of confidence in Argentine government bonds, which nearly brought down Baring Brothers, one of the oldest and most prestigious British merchant banks, and required a rescue organized by the Bank of England. The rescue of Baring Brothers was conducted primarily to protect British creditors and British financial institutions. The consequences for Argentina, a sharp recession, a devaluation of the peso, a decade of constrained government spending as debt service consumed government revenues, were the collateral damage of a financial crisis whose epicenter was in London. India, under the formal administration of the British Raj after 1858, was subject to the most direct and thoroughgoing application of the debt mechanism. The British government borrowed money in London to finance the Indian administration, the railways, the military, the civil service, and charged the cost of this borrowing to the Indian government budget. This meant that Indian taxpayers were paying interest on debts incurred in their name by a foreign government to finance an administration that served primarily British interests. The annual tribute that India paid to Britain, what the nationalist economist Dadabhai Naoroji called the drain of wealth, included not just the profits of British commercial operations in India, but the interest payments on the Indian government debt that the British had accumulated on India's behalf. Naoroji's calculation of the drain, published in 1901, estimated that Britain was extracting from India approximately £12 million per year in excess of what it was investing. This estimate has been disputed and revised in both directions by subsequent historians, but the basic principle, that the financial relationship between Britain and India was structured to transfer resources from India to Britain rather than to develop the Indian economy, is not seriously contested by anyone who has studied the period carefully. The railways that Britain built in India are often cited as examples of British investment in Indian development. The railways were financed by British capital, borrowed at guaranteed rates of return, paid by Indian taxpayers, built to specifications chosen for British rolling stock, designed to connect commodity-producing regions to British-controlled ports, and operated in ways that served British commercial interests first, and Indian development interests second, if at all. The debt mechanism worked differently in different parts of the empire, but its essential structure was consistent. Britain lent money to governments and commercial interests in territories it wanted to influence or control. The debt created a financial relationship that gave Britain leverage over the economic policies of the debtor. When the debtor government sought to change the terms of the relationship, to default on the debt, to impose tariffs that protected local industry, to nationalize British-owned assets, Britain used the threat or the reality of military force to restore the financial relationship. And when the territory was formally colonized, the cost of colonial administration was charged to the colony rather than to the British taxpayer, making the empire self-financing through the same debt mechanism that had been used to acquire it. The genius of the British imperial system, and genius is the right word, even if it was a genius deployed in service of exploitation, was that it created a self-reinforcing cycle. British financial power enabled British commercial expansion. British commercial expansion generated the profits and the tax revenues that maintained British financial power. The debt relationships that the commercial expansion created gave Britain leverage over the economic policies of its trading partners and colonies. That leverage prevented those partners and colonies from developing the industrial and financial capacity that would have reduced their dependence on British credit. And reduced dependence on British credit would have reduced British financial power. The system broke down in the 20th century for reasons that were partly internal to the British economy and partly the consequence of the two world wars, which consumed the capital that Britain had accumulated over 2 centuries of debt-financed imperial expansion. Britain entered the First World War as the world's largest creditor nation. It emerged from the Second World War as one of the world's largest debtor nations, having converted its foreign assets into war materials, and having borrowed enormously from the United States and from the sterling balances accumulated by its colonies. The debt mechanism had been reversed. Britain was now the debtor. The United States, which had lent to Britain throughout both wars, was the creditor. And the Bretton Woods system that emerged from the Second World War was, in its essential structure, an American version of the British imperial financial system, with the dollar replacing sterling as the world's reserve currency and American financial institutions replacing the City of London as the center of global credit. The history of the British Empire is usually told as a story of military conquest and political administration, with the financial dimension mentioned but not emphasized. What the financial history reveals is something more interesting and more instructive. The empire was, from beginning to end, a financial system, a system for extending British credit into new territories, using the leverage that credit created to influence the economic policies of those territories, and backing that leverage with military force when necessary. The flags and the governors and the district commissioners were the visible surface of something that was fundamentally about who owed money to whom and what the creditor could require of the debtor. This matters for understanding the world today, because the system that the British Empire pioneered did not end with the British Empire. It was inherited, adapted, and extended by the United States after 1945. The International Monetary Fund, which lends to governments in financial distress and attaches conditions to those loans that constrain the economic policies of the borrowing government, is structurally very similar to the Caisse de la Dette Publique that managed Egyptian finances after 1876. The World Bank, which finances development projects in poor countries and attaches conditions that shape the development strategies of the borrowing countries, is structurally very similar to the British merchant banks that financed Latin American infrastructure in the 19th century. The dollar-centered international financial system, in which countries that run deficits accumulate dollar debts and are therefore subject to the interest rate decisions of the Federal Reserve, is structurally very similar to the sterling-centered gold standard system, in which countries that ran deficits accumulated sterling debts and were subject to the interest rate decisions of the Bank of England. The weapons have changed. The flags have changed. The institutions have been renamed, and their rhetoric has been updated to reflect the democratic and developmental commitments of the post-colonial era. But the essential mechanism, the extension of credit to governments that then become subject to the leverage that creditors can exercise over debtors, has not changed. Understanding how Britain used debt to build its empire is therefore not merely a lesson in history, it is a lesson in how the world continues to work, in the mechanisms through which financial relationships create political leverage, and in the way that the invisible instrument of credit can be more powerful and more durable than the visible instrument of military force. The British Empire lasted approximately 400 years in various forms, from the first trading voyages of the Elizabethan era to the independence of its last significant colonies in the 1970s and 1980s. For most of that time, its primary instrument was not the gunboat but the bond, not the soldier but the banker, not the governor-general but the debt commission. The gunboat appeared when the bond failed, but the bond was the preferred instrument because it was cheaper, more flexible, more durable, and more difficult for the subjects of empire to resist or to identify as the mechanism of their subjugation. Siraj-ud-Dowlah understood that the East India Company was a threat to Bengal's sovereignty. He did not understand, could not have understood because the form was too new, that the primary threat was not the company's soldiers, but the company's credit. The soldiers won the Battle of Plassey, but the debt won Bengal. If this story changed the way you think about how empires actually work, not through flags and soldiers, but through credit and interest rates and debt commissions, subscribe. Every week we go deep on the financial mechanisms that actually drive the great events of history. Drop a comment below on whether you think the IMF and World Bank are operating the same mechanism today that the British Empire used in Egypt in 1876. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.